What's up, SDS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in true crime. It is not just a tagline, it is reality, and you'll know why after you see this panel. But first, it is week 5 of the Lori Vallow Daybell trial, and today was arguably the most stunning and pivotal day in the trial as it was revealed the hair on JJ's duct tape is, in fact, Lori Vallow's. It wasn't exactly on a duct tape, but we'll get there to that in a moment. It is the trial of the so-called Doomsday Mom, the wildly twisted story of a seemingly loving mother, a self-proclaimed devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who clearly veered way off course and became involved in the deaths of as many as 5 people, including her own children. Best guest leading the pack tonight in the yellow, Lori Hellis. She is an author and a retired criminal defense attorney. She moved to Boise from lovely Arizona to help write her book titled Children of Darkness and Light, which is also the name of her YouTube channel. And she puts out a blog called the Lori Vallow Story, and arguably knows more about this case than just about anyone. The man in the glasses, Dr. Chris Mahandi, is a clinical police and forensic psychologist with over 25 years of experience in the assessment and in management of violent behavior, which comes in handy when dealing with both the Vallows and the Daybells. He actually responded on scene to the O.J. Simpson barricade and the North Hollywood bank robbery shootout, which if you've never seen, you better Google that because it was a wild shootout. He was also the host and producer on Investigation Discovery's show Most Evil, and is the author of Born Killers and Evil Thoughts, Wicked Deeds. Then we've got Judge Ashley Wilcott, a former judge, trial lawyer, and mediator. She hosts Courts TV's live coverage weekdays from 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And of note for this subject of Lori Vallow Daybell, Judge Ashley is a certified child welfare law specialist and was the governor-appointed child advocate for the state of Georgia. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. Please follow us on Facebook, Insta, Twitter. Twitter, I put all the show times at Podcast STS is where you can find us. You can support us on Patreon, and you can support us as a YouTube member as well. It is a cliche often used in news, bombshell. But today was, in fact, a bombshell, Lori. Describe the moment and what happened.
Well, we started the day getting some fairly routine information, and then we got a DNA specialist on. Now, you might remember initially there were several hairs that had been found in the duct tape, in the sticky part of the duct tape that wrapped JJ Vallow's body. And one of those hairs was late discovered and had to be sent to a specialized lab in order to be compared. So the representative from the specialized lab was there, and we found out that the hair that had been caught in the duct tape that wrapped JJ Vallow's body was Lori Vallow's. It was a big emotional point in the trial. I was a little disappointed to see that the defense didn't push back more about it. The defense, of course, knew this evidence was out there and knew that it was going to be presented. So I was surprised they didn't push back more about it, because hair is one of those things. It's not like touch DNA. You don't have to put your hands on something in order to transfer. I'm sorry, I have barking dogs.
All good. So do I. Don't worry about
it. You don't have to put your hands on it. So we all shed hair every day, and this was her child. She was known to have this child sleep in her bedroom, sometimes sleep with her. Her brother was also sort of, if not living with her, in and out of her apartment. So there were a lot of opportunities for that hair to be picked up someplace else besides off Lori's head. And that it may come out in the defense case, but it sure didn't come out this today. And I thought they missed an opportunity to seize that emotional moment, because it was a big moment for the jury. When that information came out, you knew it was a big deal, and that was a big emotional hit for the jury. It would have made sense for the defense to come back and maybe take a little air out of that emotional moment, and they didn't do it. He dove right into picking apart the process. How do you process DNA, and what's your educational background? And he went right into whether or not they had done things right, but didn't really get into what could have been a good defense strategy of saying, yeah, okay, so.
And Lori, we'll get back into the defense strategy, because it's been tepid, to say the least, to this point, and maybe, continues today. Dr. Mahandi, you study the criminal mind. What goes on inside the mind of some of these people committing these atrocious and heinous acts. So from a macro level, watching and reading about this case, what runs through your mind when it comes to Lori Vallow?
Well, I take a look at the overall big picture of it. It's complicated to track all the players in this case. You've got so many moving parts. This relationship began and ended. You had a child with this relationship, and then this relationship started. There are a ton of moving parts and complexities in these relationships that have started, ended, overlapped. And when I see that kind of pattern in the background of a woman, in this case, the accused, the suspect, she's not been convicted of anything, she's standing trial. It does beg the hypothesis of what kind of a person we're dealing with. And I think that when you see that kind of stuff, it speaks to what we call a personality disorder, that there might be what we call borderline personality dynamics at play with her. And that's a person that forms intense attachments very quickly to other people, kind of loses their sense of self, and is quite susceptible to the ploys of other people who know how to play them. Specifically, the other part of this scenario, the other accused, I believe, is Chad, if my memory serves me correctly.
Correct.
And he's got all the markings, if true, the data of a psychopathic, narcissistic type of individual who would be a quasi-cult leader, pitching ideas and, providing the very grandiose antidote for a person that probably has a broken sense of self. So you've got what looks like kind of a little quasi-cult type dynamic happening with him, being kind of in a probably leadership role. Believe me, it sounds like she's along for the ride willingly, but susceptible for her own personality dynamics. And I see cultish stuff going on here, the doomsday beliefs, the whole outer space nonsense, but a tight dyad and a lot of manipulation, and a person that does not have a strong sense of self, that is possibly of that psychological makeup, borderline. They're very fragmented, and they will go along with stuff wholeheartedly because they're all in on anything they're in on, and they're all hating on anything they're hating on. And we see dramatic behavior from these kinds of people, and not the kind of attachments that you want to see with people that they're responsible for in a caregiving role, such as parents with their children. They're often very selfish and self-absorbed, and they can't see that other people's, ideas and thoughts matter. And of course, the psychopath doesn't care whatsoever. So you have, the appearances of that kind of dynamic, and there may be other underlying psychological issues as well, if these things are deemed true by a jury. But very dysfunctional, very just mind-blowing. That a mother would turn on their own flesh and blood. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, really foundational flaws of character in these kinds of people that would, if indeed they did these things.
And it's interesting that you brought up the word cult last night. For the second time, we had on Rick Allen Ross, who is probably the foremost preeminent thought leader on cults, an expert on cults, and the Honorable Judge Wilcott. He'd be a great guest for you as well. He goes very deep into this behavior and why people follow a putsy-looking guy like Chad Daybell. So it was fascinating. If you didn't see that, it was last night's show. Judge Wilcott, to the issue of the hair. It's the two big words of the day, the hair. So this DNA expert testified Monday morning that she found a piece of hair matching Lori Vallow Daybell's DNA profile. And at first, most people reported it on tape, found on this duct tape, found with Joshua JJ Vallow. But then later on, some reporters corrected themselves. Nate Eaton was one of East Idaho News that I was following, and he said, to clarify what I reported earlier, the tape with Lori's hair was found on the black plastic bag wrapped around JJ's body. We know that duct tape was used on JJ's wrists, ankles, and mouth. More tape was also used on the plastic wrapped around his body. So it was actually on the plastic bag. But either way, is this worthy of the news cliche bombshell? And is this the end of the road, do you think, for Lori Vallow Daybell here?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. The first is, this is the first piece of real forensic evidence that we have heard about in court. Lori can correct me if I've missed anything that connects Lori to the murders, right? And so it's significant, hugely significant to know that her hair is there on that was on JJ's body. Number two is, I agree with Lori that, honestly, why didn't the defense push back? Because you have to really own your bad facts, whether you're the prosecution or the defense. And if you have a bad fact, like this is a bad fact for her defense, in my opinion, you need to own that. You need to attack it. You need to accept it and figure out a way. Because if I were innocent, I would absolutely say, what are you talking about? I have hair all over the house. Every time I hug my kids, my hair can be left on their shoulder, on their coat, on their body. The duct tape is stored by the gardening tools, and I garden every single day, and my hair naturally is going to be in that area. There's so many different explanations. I think, however, that as the state continues to present evidence after evidence after evidence, that this particular piece of evidence will be something the jury hangs its hat on.
Shivani writes to you, the questions are coming in fast and furious from STS Nation. Good Lori, to you. People are wondering about Lori Vallow's non-reaction to today's evidence. Consider that you already heard about it beforehand from her attorneys. What were you able to make out her reaction? Was it in fact a non-reaction? And I'm curious what the rest of the courtroom and the viewing room's reaction was. And do you think it's game over?
Well, I'm not sure it's game over. I think as the judge says, it is really the first piece of concrete evidence that connects her to the murders. So I think that is important. I also think that she didn't respond because, of course, she's heard this information already, and she and her attorneys have had conversations about what they intend to do to push back. The only thing, I think they missed the opportunity to seize that emotional moment for the jury and to diffuse that, because the jury's now been imprinted with that, ooh, that was a bombshell. And it would have been smarter for them to sort of take some of the wind out of that right at the time that it happened. She has been pretty stoic throughout all of this. It's interesting that when you hear the telephone calls that she had with her son Colby and with her sister Summer, she, again, in those calls is very stoic. She's very controlled. She's very practiced, even like she's been sort of running this dialogue in her head. And the only time we have really seen her have a lot of reaction was when the more graphic photos were being shown, and she would turn her back to the photos of her children. However, she was very interested in the death scene photos of Tammy Daybell, which I thought was really interesting. She was very intent on those pictures.
I'm curious, Lori, I'll let you continue in a minute, but I'm just curious to get Dr. Mohandy's reaction to this. What about the fact that this person is accused of these heinous crimes, the ones you just talked about, including, she's convicted of killing her 2 children, one who was adopted. What about the fact that she is not reacting to this information that is potentially incredibly damaging about the hair being found? Just no reaction at all. Is it typical from people who commit crimes like this to not react?
I think that there's a whole behavioral thing that goes on in court with defendants. They typically play it close to the vest. If they have any bit of common sense or intelligence, they hold it together. They've been preparing themselves for it. This is something that they expect. They've been, either they expect it because they just know, and their attorneys have prepared them for it. It's like, because they've been told the jury's going to be watching you. They're going to be looking for your reactions. So I'd say it's really typical for there to be limited reactions by defendants accused of serious crimes, unless there's other things going on with them, such gross contempt for the proceedings that they just don't care, or if they're extremely mentally deranged, or unstable, that they can't hold it together, in which case the judge will usually stop the proceedings, right, Your Honor, and say, we need to have a timeout and see if they're competent to stand trial at this point. So there's an expectation for behavior, and they fulfill it. That's what I think.
And Dr. Mohandy, real quick. So we're coming off the Alec Murdaugh trial, which Judge Wilcott and I both covered extensively. Alec Murdaugh was convicted of killing both his wife and his son. And now we've got this woman who could be convicted of killing 2 of her children. People say this kind of casually in some ways, that they can understand the spouse. But what is this about crossing the line with your own flesh and blood?
It's unfathomable for people like you and I and people watching this show, because we attach like we should to the people that we love and care about, and we are socialized that way. We are ingrained that way. It is a gross failure of attachment. There's something wrong with these people. In Murdaugh's case, he's a freaking psychopath and a narcissist, and they don't form attachments. They lack empathy. They are callous. They are detached. It is all about them. And there are all kinds of dysfunctional human beings that have gross attachment failure. And it is the ultimate failure to be able to be capable of such an act with one's own flesh and blood, because everything about our biology and socialization screams against it. So you're going to find, usually lots of touch points psychologically as evidence of those gross failures.
And you see a lot of visceral reactions. I saw someone earlier in the chat saying they were at a doctor's appointment and they just started crying when they heard about this.
A human response.
Yeah, natural human response. TGQ, for you, Judge Wilcott, will the evidence for this case be carried over to the Arizona case involving Charles Vallow? What is your take on that?
What a great question. So in general, when you think about evidence, you have to think about whether or not it's, number one, relevant to the charges the person is facing. So charges against him, Chad. Number two, is it admissible under all the rules? So for instance, if evidence is more prejudicial than probative, the judge can say it's not allowed. If it's inadmissible hearsay, the judge can say it's not allowed. But if his charges include conspiracy, then I would say absolutely it potentially could come in, because if it's conspiracy, it's saying he was involved in some capacity. So whether he did it, whether Lori did it, he was involved. So it depends on the charges, but I think theoretically, sure, it could meet the criteria to come in as evidence.
There's your answer. It could be evidence. Dog mom weighing in. Speaking of barking dogs, Lori, to you, Larry, this is Larry Woodcock, I'm assuming, made a statement after court today saying he felt great about it, and it was the nail in her coffin. Were you there for Larry and Kay's? I assume they were both there together today.
They were.
Yeah. Did you hear this statement? And also, I wanted you to be able to finish up your previous thought. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's fine. As I was leaving the courthouse, and traffic in Boise can be a little challenging. So as I was leaving the courthouse, because I wanted to get home in time for this, they were interviewing Larry outside the courthouse. So I saw the cluster of cameras and what have you. Larry is a very, he has a gentle heart. He's a very kind man, and he has been sticking with that, and it has been a long haul for him. This case has been a very long, arduous, unexpected turn in his life. And so I'm hoping that he's going to get the closure that he needs. I know that they feel that this connects her in a way that the previous evidence hasn't. So I think it makes them feel very encouraging. And I would echo Brenda Kay's comment. I love seeing Carm last night, and really enjoyed the show. Yeah, it was wonderful.
That is Carm, for those who do not know, my 83-year-old mother who co-hosts one night a week. And we had the cult expert, and Carm was fired up talking to him. Judge Wilcott, so this person who testified today has a name, Keely Coleman, a senior DNA analyst with a place called Bode Technology. And she testified that this hair sample was found on this duct tape, which we then found out was a duct tape on the bag, and went on to say, and I quote here, the partial DNA profile matched the DNA profile provided from Lori Vallow Daybell. The probability of randomly selecting a random individual in relation to that profile is 1 in 71 billion. So that's a big number. There's only a 1 in 71 billion chance. So when the jurors hear that, what is the natural reaction? Mine would be probably leaning towards guilt. But what do you think the natural reaction of a juror would be?
Well, I think the natural reaction is, you hear, well, it's her hair, and you're thinking, how do you know it's her hair? And then you hear that statistic, one of the best statistics, if you're the prosecution trying to say it's her hair, 1 out of 71 billion. I think jurors tend to sit back and say, yep, that's her hair. Now, I think you need to be careful in this case. And again, I would defer to Lori, who's been in the viewing room watching all of this, but I don't think that from the information I've received, I'm not there in the courtroom, but our team is, that they have yet made a very clear connection to the jury to say the hair was on the duct tape, was on the bag, was on JJ. They can do that during closing. And I think they need to bring that home. But I think one hair in and of itself is not enough. I think it's how you zealously advocate on behalf of the state to convince the jury why that's enough.
Dr. Mahandi, to you, I'm just wondering, so there was a moment a few weeks back where the good Lori was saying the bad Lori saw some autopsy photos of the children, and then after lunch basically had a meltdown and said she wanted to leave court. The judge would not allow the defendant to leave the courtroom. And then there have been other times, like today, on a pretty big day, where she's been cackling and laughing with her attorneys. That was reported today as well. Kind of very low and very high moments. And then a lot of note-taking. Number one, I mean, you've been around this, so I assume obviously the jurors are watching all of this. But for forensic psychologists like you who study the criminal mind and you see this very wide range of emotions and had this essentially a breakdown in court. What does that tell you about her current mental state, if anything?
Well, a couple things. I mean, there's a number of hypotheses here. One is, what is the context for each of those for the meltdown and for the cackling behavior? Well, the context is an understandable one, whatever the issue may be. You've got, autopsy photos of the children being shown. And, if it's true that she did these crimes or participated in them, she has probably walled away, the images of what she saw and did. So putting it up there is like, here it is. This is reality. It's a freaking reality check. And it's, even if she participated in it, it's still traumatic to see that, because this isn't, until these events have happened, there's no known history of her ever having participated in anything like this. So I would not be surprised, even if she is guilty of these things, for her to have a reaction like that. It's reality. As far as the cackling and that kind of thing in court, people with certain kinds of personalities, are, and I intimated earlier about borderline personality in particular, they are prone to wide ranges of emotion, like to severe mood swings, going from super highs to super lows in a matter of moments to minutes. They're very reactive as individuals, very dramatic. And so, there can be that aspect contributing to it as well. The note-taking, a lot of defendants do that. It's a way of occupying their time, of staying attentive. It doesn't necessarily mean they're writing about the case necessarily. They could be writing all work and no play, make Jack and Dalton, for all we know. But it is something that many defendants will do. And the other issue to consider as a hypothesis is it's, and I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to this, is it's theatrics. What would, if you're a defendant that knows you're guilty, and they're looking at the jury, well, what would an innocent person do in response to these photos? They'd be upset. That's those are my children. I should be crying right here. And you can get some theatricality as a hypothesis. But I'm more inclined to go with the first hypothesis of this is reality, and you've managed to bury it if you indeed you were guilty of this, and now it's uncovered, and you got to look at what you done, at what you did, and that's, it's not theoretical anymore. It's visceral.
Baby doll, friend of the show. Hey y'all, Judge Wilcott looks like Adele. How about that?
I love you. Thank you.
So, Judge, Lori talked about this. Good, Lori, and we'll get back into it now. The defense had a chance to cross this expert witness, and they argued, the defense of Miss Coleman, that only a small portion of the full DNA sequence had been examined because the hair did not yield a full DNA profile, and therefore the results could be interpreted as inconclusive. Now, if I'm a juror, again, I'm sort of falling asleep at that defense, but why didn't they just say exactly what you guys just said, which is she slept in the same bed with JJ, they were close, mother and son, the hair could just be there. Why not make any of these arguments? Why go down this road? And what's your take overall been on the defense so far? Because it's been a little weak.
So I think if I were the defense attorney, I would have gone there. I would have said, you can't say where this hair is from. You don't know if it's from her sleeping in the same bed as JJ, do you? And those obvious answers are going to be no. And you want the jury on cross to hear your question. You don't really care about the answer because you want them to hear what your point is. I would have done that. The defense has frankly been rather quiet in this case. In my perspective, having been on the bench, a lot of defense attorneys, boy, they go after it and they don't leave a stone unturned. And I don't think that's the personality, demeanor, or approach of this defense team from what we've seen so far. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is play devil's advocate and say, keep in mind things like saying could have been anybody's, anyway, any reasons that hair could have gotten there. You can always wait and argue that on closing argument. right? And tell the jury, listen, you don't know where that hair came from. But I still think they could have asked that question on cross to really bring it home.
And we will get back to these details, but one of the things that struck me today, good Lori, is that it was reported that the jurors, which they do every day, but it seemed like today they were taking a few more moments to stand and stretch. It was reported that they were chatting it up quite a bit with each other. People in the audience were standing. And these days are long to just sit there and listen to testimony. How do you think the jurors are holding up at this point? And do you still believe this trial is going to be over much sooner than anticipated? It was an 8-week time frame at first.
Yeah, I still think the trial is close to winding down. I don't know. Oh, I have to correct. I have to answer that question because it's not accurate.
Okay, you can answer it. Go for it.
Sorry. Kay Woodcock and Charles Vallow were brother and sister. So Lori's fourth husband, Charles, was Kay's brother. Kay Woodcock has a son. His name is Todd. And Todd and his girlfriend were JJ's parents. When JJ was born, he was removed from them at the hospital because he was born drug affected, and he was placed with Kay and Larry right out of the hospital. He was a premature baby. He was in the NICU for a while, and then he was placed with Kay and Larry. Charles then approached his sister, Kay, who is the grandmother of JJ, and said, we're interested in adopting him. By that time, they knew JJ had special needs. Kay and Larry live in a small town in Louisiana, and Charles and Lori were living in the Phoenix metro area where there are a lot more services available for special needs kids. And so the family, as a family, agreed that they were the best people to potentially adopt the baby. So I also did lots of juvenile work in my career. So and so that's what happened. Todd, I can't imagine the level of guilt that there must be for these birth parents who really at the time felt like they were doing what was absolutely best for this baby,
Mm-hmm.
and could in no way have foreseen that this was going to happen. I know that Kay and Larry also feel a tremendous amount of that guilt. Kay's son, Todd, has been into a long-term drug treatment program and is now finished with that program and is working on maintaining his sobriety. Unfortunately, last year, JJ's mother died of a drug overdose. So, I mean, this case is sort of like the case that keeps on giving. It's like that rock that falls in the pool and has all of those cascading effects going out. It's a horrible case just from the standpoint of we have a mother who's killed her children, but then what comes off of that is just as awful.
From the guy who's under contract to write a book right now, I don't envy you, Lori, writing a book about this case because it has so many twists and turns. I cannot imagine keeping track of all this.
Yeah.
Dr. Mahandi, from a very macro perspective, why are tens of thousands of people watching this show on Lori Vallow Daybell? Why are they tuning into Court TV? Why are people so fascinated by the Lori Vallow Daybells of the world? Is it because they're so different than us or make us feel better about ourselves? What is it?
Wow, there's a lot in that question, Joel. I just think it's so antithetical to how people react to parenting, to protecting the innocent, to that deepest sense of responsibility that almost all of us are born with and learn from the earliest times. And it goes so against that everybody wants to know why. I think is the most solid reason for why, probably the most pervasive reason why people want to learn more about it is, why would somebody betray the very foundation of who we are as human beings? They want to know, like, what is it? What variables went to play here? I want to understand this. This is not anything that would even enter my mind. And there's so much of it in this case. And there's so much to unravel, like as good Lori was saying. I mean, I have a hard time following the players. It's amazing you can, good Lori, but you're in the courtroom having it pounded into you. And I'm sure the jury is like spending hours trying to figure out who's who. And it's confusing. It's disturbing. It's disillusioning. And it runs against the very fabric of humanity. And I think that's why people want to find out more about it.
And that's a great explanation. I know back to the Alec Murdaugh trial, the big question, even at the end, which has never been answered, 3 letters, why? So that is what keeps people intrigued. Bobby Henson writes, hi from Dallas. Lori was close to Chad. This one's for you, Judge Wilcott. Alex and JJ, trust me, a woman, not because of this, Judge, not because of this, but trust me, she writes, a woman reaches an age where she sheds like a Labrador retriever. One piece of hair, unfortunately, means nothing. And then that's followed by this comment here from Irene. The defense is very weak. It's almost like they know it's hopeless. Why isn't the defense? Why wouldn't the defense say what this last person just said, that women at a certain age shed like a Labrador retriever? No big deal.
Well, because where are you going to say that? Keep in mind, we're still in testimony where you have to ask questions. And so you have an expert on the stand that's an expert in DNA that can say this is who this piece of hair belongs to. But that doesn't mean this is an expert on how much you shed when you get older or how much of your hair comes out. So it's not an appropriate question evidence-wise of this witness. Now, maybe they could call a witness, the defense could, that is an expert in hair loss. And they could testify and say, listen, this is how many hairs you lose a day, and it's natural shedding, and you can't say where it's going to fall out or where it's not. So it's not that they can't ask that question. It's that they have to have the right witness to ask that question of, and I'll let everybody keep in mind, innocent until proven guilty. And right now we haven't yet heard the defense's case. So they may have those kinds of experts. We just have to wait and see.
Well, I'll jump in on that if I could, Joel. I mean, that's like the honorable judge is saying, that's a rebuttal expertise issue that will probably come up in the defense case. But I'll throw this out as just kind of a question to both counsel here. Do you think that there's enough in the failure to at least cross on that issue in some manner, that there could be these seeds for an IAC or ineffective assistance of counsel, with this kind of thing? I don't know that there is, but I thought I'd throw it out there to you guys since we're asking about it.
Judge?
All right. So ineffective assistance of counsel, in my experience, in my opinion, is not taken lightly and can be hard to prove. One question not being asked on cross in and of itself is not going to be, in my opinion, an effective assistance of counsel. But if you look at the entire trial and you find that counsel has not challenged all of the evidence presented on the whole, if you end up with a conviction, if you find that there's exculpatory evidence that they did not explore, that they did not present, that they didn't present their own experts, then yes, altogether cumulative, it could rise to that level. I think it's too early to say at the moment, but I always think when there's a conviction that that's going to be considered, period. But I would now defer to Lori.
Well, I think it always comes up, and certainly I've said it probably would be malpractice not to make it an issue on an appeal, but it's a steep hill to climb. Because not only do you have to prove that your lawyer messed up beyond reason, so beyond what a reasonable lawyer of equal stature would have done. But then the second step is you have to prove that had it not been for your lawyer's malpractice, that the outcome would have been different. And so that is hard to prove. Well, I would have been found not guilty had it not been that my lawyer messed up. And sure, I mean, there are glaring kinds of cases where exculpatory information is overlooked and a person gets convicted, and clearly that's reversible. But that is the rare occasion and not common at all.
So good Lori knows this. John Pryor is Chad Daybell's attorney. He was back in court, and a lot of people have been wondering what he's doing in court. Is he strategizing already for Chad's defense, which he must be? But this question has come up, so let's just get it out of the way here, Lori. I want someone on the panel to talk about Chad's attorney, John Pryor. He was convicted of sexual assault on a 19-year-old back in 2012. How is it he's still not disbarred? How is that possible?
Well, here's how it's possible. It was quite a few years ago. He was accused of sexual misconduct with this young woman. And I honestly don't know. I don't remember at this point. It seems to me that she was not a potential client. She may have been somebody he was interviewing for a job. That's kind of what sticks in my mind. What happened was he was charged, and in the midst of his trial, which apparently wasn't going great for the prosecution, they offered him a deal and he pled out to a misdemeanor. And in the state of Idaho, being convicted of a misdemeanor is not a basis for disbarment. So that's the answer. And yes, he is in trial in the courthouse at least some portion of every day.
Dr. Mahandi, this one comes from Sally Vella. She, meaning Lori Vallow, is a serial killer who knew every one of her victims. Assuming she is convicted of these multiple homicides, and it's possible she could be convicted in the death of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, does that make her a serial killer?
I mean, technically, if you have
great question.
3 or more murders separated by a cooling off period, depending which definition you use, there might be some that would argue yes. We certainly, it'll depend what the motive was. Like sometimes people consider a serial killer somebody that does it for sexual reasons. Other times it might include, there actually could be a violent true belief that's driving it. We certainly saw that with Joe Paul Franklin, who committed 23 something murders or whatever. But if so, it certainly argues towards that definition. We've had what we call, quote, black widows. If there is a financial motive for it, which there may be, there were some fingerprints, and I don't mean that in a literal sense, but there's some, there seem to be some indicators that there might have been some financial motives involved in it. But you look at Aileen Vernos's case in Florida. I mean, this could be, if she's convicted, arguably considered a serial killing type of situation.
That is the definition, but at the end of the day, she would have killed 2 of her kids, and it's horrific no matter how she is labeled. Good Lori. Shivani writes, can we recall that Lori Vallow didn't want Mr. Archibald to be her attorney? Really, her defense has little or nothing to work with from her. I'm not convinced that the defense even likes her. Was there an issue where she did not want him to represent her? And number 2, you're a criminal defense attorney, retired now. What do you do if you don't like your client? Or maybe you don't even think they're innocent?
Good questions. My recollection is that she did not want to lose Mark Means. I don't know that it was that she didn't want Mr. Archibald, but that she had a connection or an attachment to her first lawyer, Mark Means. And he was originally retained. Neither Mark Means nor John Pryor had qualifications, really. John Pryor is an experienced lawyer and has tried felonies, and it certainly has many more bona fides than Mark Means had. Mark Means had never tried a felony case when he took Lori Vallow's case. So, but they were both retained. And in the state of Idaho, you don't have to meet the qualification criteria if you are privately retained. So she was quite attached to Mark Means for whatever reason. I don't think that she really cared whether Jim Archibald came on or not, but she did not want to lose Mark Means. He eventually, the court found that he had at one point very early in the case represented both Chad and Lori. It was before the charges were filed for Chad, but he was giving Chad legal advice. So he was representing both of them. So, and the judge said that's a conflict and booted him off the case. By that time, Lori had been declared indigent and Jim Archibald had already been appointed. Now, he's a very experienced head of the public defender's office for that district and has tried many murder cases. He's death penalty qualified. So he certainly was a more, at least on paper, a more qualified defense attorney than the one she had. As far as liking your clients, I have to say over the years, I usually found something likable about my clients, but not always. And on those occasions when I had a client I didn't like, I just had to remember that my job wasn't to like them. My job was to make sure that they had an appropriate defense and that their rights were protected and that the state's evidence was put to the test. So,
can I add something to that?
100%.
In my experience, just like I'm certain Lori was a good criminal defense attorney, criminal defense attorneys are not just zealously fighting for their client. As a result of that, they're fighting for all of our constitutional rights because it's a slippery slope, right? If you don't defend one person's rights, it negatively affects all of our rights. And so every defense attorney that I've seen in my courtroom that I know, I don't think thinks about whether or not they like the client. That's not the point. It's how do I defend this person and ensure all their rights are protected? And I think that's the most important piece.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of defense attorneys, and I've been impressed with I've worked with a lot. I work both prosecution as an expert and defense, and I've been very impressed with the professionalism of the defense attorneys that I've worked with, and how much they give of themselves. And it's a thankless job a lot of times. So they got to believe in something really deep to carry them through the many disappointments that they experience in their pursuit of mercy and justice, and the rights that are afforded to us in our country by our Constitution. So I will just echo that professionalism, in my experience, outweighs any kind of rifts that may evolve. Now, where it gets interesting is when the client becomes difficult to manage, and that's just frustration. That's not liking or not liking. It's just like, geez, you're not helping me help you. But that's not anything to do with likability. That's really just, their commitment to professionalism is what I see time and time again.
And speaking of managing your client, Lori Hellis, if you knew that this evidence was coming out about, it's weird that happened. If you knew this evidence was coming out about the hair, would you instruct your client to not have a reaction? And maybe that's why she had no reaction.
Sure. I certainly would. I think that her attorneys have been counseling her and advising her from the beginning. You need to play it very cool and very calm, because even though her mental health has not been discussed in trial, I think there is a natural reaction, as the doctor was saying. We all look at what she's done and think this is absolutely incomprehensible. Nobody can understand how a mother could do this to her children. So the jury are already looking for some sort of indication. Why did she do this? And the last thing you want your client to do in that situation is act irrationally or act in a way that emotionally or in a way that's going to telegraph to the jury, my client is not stable, because you don't want that impression in their deliberations.
Special shout out to Papa Bear watching us from Moscow, Idaho. Of course, now home to those horrific quadruple homicides, and there will be a hearing in that case coming up in June. So we have the best audience in all of true crime, and not only do they ask questions in the chat, but they tweet at me too. And Judge Wilcott, to you, one of the questions tweeted at me today: does Chad throw Lori under the bus now and then back over her?
So I was expecting, quite frankly, I was expecting them to turn on each other as soon as these trials got separated. And I kept waiting. And then we heard in this trial that Chad Daybell is not expected to testify against her. Now, there's some good legal reasons why not, because he's still facing his charges and he would probably invoke his Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself. But all of that aside, I really, truly expected him to come to court and throw her under the bus. So the fact that he's not expected to testify, I now question if either of them is going to do that to the other. And I think he's going to wait and see what happens, right? He's going to wait and see what happens and then decide. And I think if it's self-serving, he will do it.
Dr. Mahandi, Brenda writes, 46 guns bought by Alex and stored in Lori's storage unit. I can only imagine what was in store for future victims. Obviously, this cult was heating up. People didn't kind of fit their modus operandi. They were targeted. Do you have any doubt that there would have been future victims?
Well, I think the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. And you got, once that genie's out of the bottle of homicidal, behavior, I think it makes it much more likely, that would be resorted to again. It almost reminds me of something in the very distant past, the Synanon murders, if you may recall that from way back when in the 70s in California. It's like, you start resorting to violence as a quasi cult, it kind of becomes your go-to. So, if your only tool in life is a hammer, the whole world starts to look like a nail. Yeah, I'd be concerned with those 46 guns for sure, and what they could be used for. If it's true that these things have happened and if it's laid squarely at the feet of these people that are part of this, absolutely.
And on the, I know this isn't a technical term in your field, but on the crazy scale, where does this rank?
Well, wow, that's a crazy scale. I did a show called Most Evil where we rated people. I think it was a 22-point scale or something, but it was really almost like a rating of just of like psychopathy and just evil and just malevolence with no real, just no real purpose. Just next level terrible, if you will. It's up there pretty damn high. When you start talking about, hurting innocent children and you by a parent turning their back on their children and the need to protect, if indeed these things are true, that's next level. It's up there. I wouldn't label it crazy because I don't want to, assert some sort of defense when we don't know that that's an issue. Because insanity, that's a legal thing. And if I use the word crazy, that could go there potentially. I think it's certainly unhinged and lacking in empathy, callous, and just super pathological. How about that?
Good answer. Good way to explain it. Good Lori from Aries Athena. Do you think they didn't push back on the hair that much, meaning the defense, because her defense knows that worse is coming when Melanie or others take the stand? Is there much worse still ahead, do you think? I mean, it's been pretty bad up to this point.
Yeah, I don't know, but I do want to comment on the prior question.
Sure.
What was testified to was that Alex spent a lot of money at Sportsman's Warehouse, and he made 42 gun-related purchases. So some of them were silencers and other gear. So it wasn't 42 guns, but it was still plenty of guns. But the other comment I had was, well, he took shots at 2 people and missed both times. So maybe he's not, maybe he's not so dangerous. People keep asking when Melanie Boudreau is going to testify, and I'm not sure she is. I don't know what she really adds to the story. This is Lori's niece. She was very involved in the cult kind of groups. She was involved in the little coven that was doing castings, and she was involved but I'm wondering whether her testimony won't be more effective when it comes to the Arizona charges and Charles Vallow's death. So I'm a little bit surprised that if they were going to bring her out, that they didn't do it at the same time they brought out Melanie Gibb and Zulema, because what she will testify to has a lot more to do with the belief system and what they were doing during that time. So I'm not even sure we're going to see her. So, and I don't know that we're going to see some big bombshell. I think if we were going to see it, we would have seen it by now. Instead, what we're seeing is a very well thought out and serviceable presentation of the facts in the case and of the evidence.
Judge, back to you. So a couple people tweeted questions at me, and the consensus was this was a really bad day for Lori Vallow. So one of the questions was, basically, if the defense knew about this, did the prosecution just refuse to accept some sort of plea deal? Do you think there's any chance that, there was negotiations going on before this trial and this defense, tried to plea and the state said no, and it's because of what we saw today?
Well, I always think that in our justice system, there's room for negotiation, meaning the conversation should always be had, in my opinion, even if it's never going to reach an agreement. So I would hope there was negotiation. But keep in mind, the death penalty is not on the table for Lori Vallow. And a lot of times the death penalty is a negotiating tool, right? But it's not even on the table for her. And so now you're looking at, I'm assuming, crimes as egregious as this, for a state to accept any type of plea, I think they're going to require life without ever getting out of jail. And I think most defendants are going to say, I'm not agreeing to that. I'll take my chances because I'm not going to do any worse. So I think that may be what played out here.
This comment was meant in jest. It's kind of funny, but maybe there's an element of truth. With the rise of true crime, one day we will be able to go to Vegas and bet on trial verdicts and sentencings. Who knows the way?
Well, I'll offer a comment. I think that people do bet on this stuff. Unfortunately, I understand that there is
really. I didn't know
illicit betting on certain trials for sure.
Do you know where that takes place? That's pretty wildly fascinating.
Yeah, I don't participate in it. So
I've heard of the same as well. I don't either, but I've heard of that as well.
That smells like a future show to me. Dr. Mahandi, to you. One of the things that really triggers people, and I understand it, is equating mental illness with crazy. There are a lot of people, millions, tens of millions of people suffering from mental illness. So how do you delineate that when dealing with a person like Lori Vallow, who might be mentally ill, but she's also a wackadoodle crazy person? But what about all those who are suffering from mental illness and keep their jobs? Possibly just take some medication and lead relatively normal lives. How do you describe, delineate all that for the audience?
The most important thing to remember is that most mentally ill people do not do anything violent or harmful to anyone else. They're just people like you and me. Maybe they've got some anxiety, a little bit of depression. Maybe they've got a past trauma they're trying to resolve. They're having a problem with their kid that they're upset about. These are there's a lot of that going on. They got, ADHD or whatever. And some of that stuff is treated with talk therapy, some by medication, and some is just worked through the naturally occurring healing resources that exist in people's lives. But I will say this: if you're watching the show and you feel like you might do something you shouldn't, there's help out there for you. You've got resources to the suicide prevention hotline, mental health resources in most states, hotlines, through your insurance company, whatever. Get the help that you need. But most mentally ill or people that are grappling with mental issues are not a harm to anybody else, and that's a stigma that needs to be undone, if you will, because it exists out there. There are a handful of people that have certain kinds of symptoms that make it more likely they're going to be aggressive towards others. If you have a serious mental illness in which the command hallucinations are to hurt other people, that's going to be a specific situation with a very specific symptomatology that is problematic, or they're telling you to hurt yourself, or if a component of your mental illness is to harm yourself, or you're not perceiving accurately, who people are around, you're too paranoid and you think everybody's trying to harm you. There are specific instances where certain specific symptoms are problematic, but the vast majority of people grappling with issues, do not pose any risk to anybody else, and that stigma needs to be, again, undone. So, the issue of using the terms mentally ill, crazy is just an everyday term we use for things that we just think are over the top. And as long as we're using it like that, and it's not meant to stigmatize mentally ill, we know when I say crazy, I mean something that is just beyond what we need, what we as civilized people should be doing. If you're using it that way, cool. But if you're using it in a way that is meant, to imply that the person is mentally ill, that's the problem when that term is used, because then it becomes something that reinforces a stigma.
And there's some more testimony from today. This is one of the things that kind of came up, good Lori. I was going to ask you something else, but just saw this comment. Lori in Rexburg lived in apartment 175. According to detectives, apartment 107 that was rented for Alex was completely empty. Could 107 be the place the children were killed in and rented for that specific purpose? Not the question I was going to ask you. Any thoughts on this, good Lori?
Yeah, there were 3 apartments rented, 107, 175, and one other one, the number escapes me right now, that belonged to Melanie Boudreau. I don't know that she was there very much or very long. And my understanding is that if you look at the cell data and all of that information, Alex was living in 107. I think that when the welfare check came in and everybody was sort of scattering, his apartment was emptied. It wasn't completely empty because they did find things in the apartment that belonged to him. Some things were in Lori Vallow's apartment in like a guest bedroom, but his things were also in apartment 107. So I don't know. It was a strange family, and they kind of, they went back and forth. But I'm fairly confident that 107 wasn't just rented to serve as the place that they murdered the children.
And good Lord, the question I was going to ask you. So this now infamous raccoon text came back into testimony today. It came up at 10:46 local time with FBI Special Agent Rick Wright on the witness stand. And he talks about how we see this raccoon text that Chad Daybell sent to Tammy on Monday, September 9th, telling her he had been burning limb debris when he saw a raccoon and had to kill and bury it in the family pet cemetery. What is this all about? I mean, was this just a roundabout way of hiding the murders?
Yeah. When it caught the FBI's attention because they very rarely texted more than a few words to one another. It was, I'm going here, okay. Very short, very utility-minded text. And so what was interesting to the FBI was the fact that in the middle of all these texts is this narrative. And he says, I decided I was going to, I think this was very Freudian on his part, frankly. He says, I decided that I was going to burn all the limb debris off the trees before it rained. And then he tells the story about the raccoon. Well, the whole point was to explain to Tammy, A, why there had been a fire in the fire pit, and B, why they'd been digging in the pet cemetery. Because my impression of what happened was they brought Tylee to the property, likely already dismembered, and they tried to burn her remains. Burning a body is not as simple as it seems. Crematoriums use high-powered gas jets to reduce bodies to ashes at 800 degrees. So just throwing on a little gasoline and lighting a match is not going to do it. They didn't discover that until they really were time pressured. Tammy was still alive. She was coming home from work. And they realized that they needed to get this taken care of. They had this weird neighbor who walked up and down the canal, making sure that nobody was using water that didn't belong to them from the irrigation canal. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why he wanted to get this done. So they took Tylee's remains, they put it in a big 5-gallon bucket, what was left, and they buried that bucket. Chad was trying to explain to Tammy why there was soil that had been disrupted in the pet cemetery, why it looked like somebody had been digging there, and why the fire pit had been used. So that was the whole purpose of the text.
Thank you for the clarification. We're going to wrap in a few minutes. A couple more questions here, Judge, for you. Christina pointing out, one juror had prominent reactions to today's testimony, according to reporting, pursing their lips and rolling eyes. I don't know if you presided over jury trials, but if you did you look at the jurors? But certainly this is maybe a telltale sign that that they're thinking certain thoughts, possibly. What say you?
I think everybody in the courtroom looks at the jurors periodically. And yes, I think that their facial expressions give them away. But I will just caution and say, even though they may have an extreme reaction to one piece of evidence or another, at the end of the day, remember, the whole point of the deliberation is because they have to go back there and discuss it all. So the reaction to one thing may not be where they land at the end of the day, but I've seen all kinds of reactions. You kind of get it all, and they're humans, they're people. You're going to see their expressions, and it often tells you what they're thinking at that moment.
And Darius, I'm not putting the comment up, so I got to get to this question, says, your hair on murder victim is high-level comedy, #perspective. So not everyone thinks it's a serious or a big deal. So and that's what makes America great. We can agree to disagree here. A question for Dr. Mahandi from Barbara. Dr. M, I think both Lori and Chad fit the disorder Machiavellian manipulators, very dangerous people. What do you say?
Well, I go by the DSM-5 TR, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th version, the text revision published in 2022. And there is not a disorder that's called Machiavellian manipulators. But I think I know what you're talking about here. I think you're talking about psychopathy. And I do believe that if these things are true, that even if Lori, bad Lori, is borderline personality, and Chad is just a straight psychopath and a narcissist, that Lori still can be borderline personality and have prominent psychopathic traits. So I do think that it's plausible that both have, certain aspects of their character structure that is flawed in that way that makes them manipulative, deceptive, detached, not attaching to people the way that they should, and that would be consistent with what I think you mean by Machiavellian manipulators. Basically, antisocial, psychopathic tendencies, if you will.
Flyover girl for the good Lori. Do you think this is an interesting question here? Do you think Chad's kids were indoctrinated? Garth seemed awfully calm when Tammy died. Did he consider her a zombie?
So I don't know whether Chad's children have embraced his ideas about people becoming zombies and their souls being forced out of their bodies. But I do think that there is a lot of evidence that Chad's children were somewhat sensitive to what he was teaching. That the LDS Church always seems to call it teaching. We do know that when Chad and Tammy, when Chad announced that he thought they should move from Springville, Utah, where they had all lived forever, to Rexburg, nobody was very excited about that except Chad. And finally, Tammy kind of came around to it. Garth, their oldest son, was attending BYU in Provo and didn't really want to go to Rexburg. And so he stayed on in school, but he was getting a lot of pressure from Dad to come home. Now, at this point, all their kids were early college age. They were all adult age. And the youngest one may have still been at home. And he called Garth and said, listen, there is an evil spirit that is after you, and I can't protect you if you don't come home. And Garth left school at BYU and moved to Rexburg. So I know that there was that sort of influence going on. Chad very clearly said, I am the patriarch of the family. I make these decisions. If I say there's an evil spirit following you, there is. So I don't know whether he had actually gotten them to make the leap to people are zombies, but he certainly had influenced them to that extent.
Judge, two more questions and we'll wrap her up. Jennifer M. Will Lori take the stand? Will this ever happen, Judge?
Let me take my crystal ball, right, and shake it, because none of us know. It's been the great topic of discussion with myself and all my great legal analyst guests. And I think the advice of counsel will be, no, you are not taking the stand, because generally you don't want a criminal defendant on the stand. With her, I think she may be one of these people who believes that she can convince, manipulate. And I think she's at peace with whatever she's done. And I think she may insist on taking a stand. After all, it's her decision, not her lawyers.
Got a lot of potential defense attorneys here. Sherry writing, has anyone considered that Alex intentionally put the hair on the tape? They could have made that argument. Maybe that's a crazy idea. Followed by, what is the probability that the hair is from someone in her family, say a brother? Judge says no. And then Diana says, the hair is not significant to me, and I'm not on Team Lori. The hair could have been on his pajamas, and she was his mother who did his laundry. That's an argument that Jim Archibald could have made. One final thing, good Lori, that came up in court today around 2 p.m. local time. They started talking about Tammy's death. She died in Utah. Dr. Eric Christensen is the chief medical examiner there and said that there were a number of ways people could be asphyxiated, which is the way that she was killed, and said that there were bruises on her arms that happened in the hours around the time of her death that are consistent with someone being restrained and would be consistent with asphyxia being cause of death as well. How come that comes into play here? Most people, I don't think, associate necessarily Lori with Tammy's death, but why the importance of bringing that testimony in today?
Well, she is one of the victims, and Lori is charged with conspiracy to murder Tammy, but Chad is charged with murdering her. And so when there's a conspiracy, you have to show that one of the conspirators at least took a substantial step to commit the crime. So I think it is important to show that one of the conspirators did the crime that they were conspiring to do. And in that case, it's to murder Tammy. So sure, they needed to show that her cause of death was murder. And that was pretty clear. I mean, there was a pretty clear, if you, they put a graph up on the, an outline of a human body up on the screen. And then they had the medical examiner mark where the bruises were. And it's very telling. They're on her upper arms, where somebody would hold you if they were trying to restrain you, and on her chest, which would make sense if somebody had, say, their knee in your chest and were holding a pillow over your face. So, I mean, it made a certain amount of sense to bring that information in.
The Honorable Ashley Wilcott is a former judge, trial lawyer, and mediator. She hosts Court TV's live coverage every weekday from 3 to 6, and she's a certified child welfare law specialist. Thank you for joining us again, Judge. I'm just curious, what's the interest at Court TV been like for this trial? Are you getting a lot of questions about it, a lot of interest?
All of that. And I think the universal, question we get is, why is this not on TV? Well, because the judge made the decision that it won't be televised, but we've got a team in the courtroom, and it makes a huge difference to be able to have people like Lori who are watching, report out so that we get real, true, accurate information. So thank you all for having me.
Yorkie Love, Dr. Chris Mahandi. I remember him from Breaking Homicide. So brilliant, and OMG, handsome. If you didn't know, he's a clinical police and forensic psychologist with over 25 years of experience. He's in LA, and he's a celebrity forensic psychologist. He reported on scene to the O.J. Simpson barricade. He was the host and producer of Investigation Discovery's show Most Evil. He's written the books Born Killers and Evil Thoughts, Wicked Deeds. Dr. Mahandi, do we live in a wicked world or a good world here? What's your final big picture statement to lift spirits on this Monday?
I think good always triumphs over evil, Joel. And I think that the universal push is for justice and mercy. And thank you for having me on your show today. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here with such an esteemed panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And finally, last but certainly not least, Lori Hellis is a big friend of the show, an author and a retired criminal defense attorney. She moved to Boise. She's going to be writing her book titled Children of Darkness and Light, also the name of her YouTube channel. I know people wanted a YouTube video at lunchtime today. They were begging for it after the hair development. And of course, her blog is called the Lori Vallow Story. Good Lori, not bad Lori, but good Lori. When is this going to end?
Well, I predicted that we were going to see the prosecution rest maybe as early as Friday. So, and we didn't see it. So I honestly don't know, but I can't imagine that there's a whole lot more that they have to present that's really relevant to the jury making a decision. So I still think the prosecution is going to rest maybe tomorrow or Wednesday, and I think we'll be going forward. It might even go to the jury by Friday, but maybe middle of the following week.
We are in the home stretch, and that means we've got to figure out some other shows. So STS Nation, you guys can always email me, survivingthesurvivor@gmail.com, if you got some good show ideas. Makes my job easier. Meanwhile, quick programming note, we will be live tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern time on the Lori Vallow Daybell trial, and every day this week, except Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. It is Great Scott. It's your true crime Phil with Detective Phil Waters and FBI agent Scott Duffy. Until then, love you, America. Love you, Boise. Love you, LA. Love you, Atlanta.